June 4, 1942. 10:20 a.m. Above the Pacific, steam and smoke curl from carrier decks as aviators strap in. On Akagi's bridge, the island of Midway has been struck, and the fleet believes itself master of the sea. Until the sky erupts and the great strike force is torn apart. You are on the flight deck. This is the Japanese moment of shock. Akagi, confidence on the edge of disaster. Midway Atoll sits small and remote in a pale blue ocean, a pinprick on a chart. On the flagship Akagi, the morning air tastes of avgas and hot metal. Sailors move with the crisp choreography of men who have practiced the same drill for years. Engines warmed, ordnance readied, the great flight deck a lattice of steel and canvas, folding wings and painted squadron numbers. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, is at the height of its power. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu form the hammer that has, until this day, shattered enemy fleets across the Pacific. Their pilots are veterans hardened in China and the early months of war. Their ground crews can arm and launch 100 aircraft in minutes. Triumph has been habitual. Pride flows like oil through the ship's veins. On the bridge, the light is sharp. Nagumo stands with his staff, a figure of steady composure trained into habit. Around him, men consult range tables, scrutinize sparse radio reports, and track the returning strike groups. Hours earlier, the Kido Butai had hurled a precise wave of aircraft at Midway Island. 108 planes launched in minutes, to silence island defenses and clear the way for invasion forces. That attack, efficient and devastating, appears to have gone according to plan. Scouts report flak and some damage, but there is no sign of the American fleet. The map on the chart room table shows empty ocean where enemy carriers should be. From the standpoint of doctrine and training, everything looks kosher. Neutralize the island, hold reserves for fleet interception, prepare a powerful, coordinated strike once the enemy shows. Below the calm, a tangle of urgent work is underway. Half the Kido Butai's air groups are in reserve aboard their carriers, armed with torpedoes and heavy armor-piercing bombs for use against ships. From the hangars, crews begin the slow, dangerous chore of removing torpedoes and hoisting land bombs into their aircraft, a process that will take time and fill deck spaces with fuel lines, munitions, and men. The carriers are at a vulnerable moment. Decks full of armed planes, crews exposed, and fighter patrols circling lower to fight off the island's last sorties. The picture is textbook for an air force trained to concentrate firepower and launch coordinated attacks in waves. It is also a picture that assumes clean skies above. Onlookers below and above the deck exchange the easy jokes of sailors who have never been denied. In wardrooms and on the quarterdecks, there is a quiet certainty that the American fleet is no longer a strategic threat. It was supposed to be rooted in Pearl Harbor or crippled at sea. To Japan's senior leadership, this is a decisive moment. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's gamble to draw out the U.S. carriers and destroy them once and for all. The grand plan, Operation MI, is a masterpiece of ambition. A baited trap using Midway as lure, a diversion to the north at the Aleutians, and the full might of the combined fleet waiting like a fist. The Kido Butai's airmen have been the spearhead of that fist, but there are threads in the tapestry Nagumo cannot see. Communications are sparse by Japanese design. Radio silence and dispersed forces are meant to preserve surprise. The plan's success depends on secrecy and on a single truth. American carriers will sail to defend Midway and be drawn into the net. What the Kido Butai does not know, what its greatest flaw will be, is that U.S. naval intelligence has already read their hand. American codebreakers in Pearl Harbor have largely penetrated the Japanese operational cipher, JN-25. Admiral Chester Nimitz knows the enemy's objective, and he has positioned his limited carrier forces, Enterprise, Hornet, and a hastily repaired Yorktown, to intercept. Back on Akagi, the morning's tempo tightens. At 07:00, a carrier reconnaissance radioed that the Midway strike had not wholly silenced the island. The request for a second strike filtered up through the chain. That decision, bureaucratic and operational, unravels into motion. Ordnance teams are asked to reconfigure aircraft for land attack. At 07:28, a delayed scout relays a new chilling report. Contacts. Ships sighted. Nagumo orders preparations for an anti-ship strike. Crews, already mid-conversion, now face a mad scramble to rearm for a sea fight. By 08:20, new reports suggest the contacts may include a carrier. Orders flip and spin like deck aircraft tumbling in a wind. Torpedoes left on some planes, bombs fit to others. The hangars become an engine-heated hazard of fuel, cordite, and men. The doctrinal puzzle that will doom Nagumo is simple and terrible. Japanese carrier doctrine, refined through success, favors carefully prepared strike packages, bombers escorted by fighters in coordinated waves, launched with precise timing. That doctrine is sound for the majority of engagements the Kido Butai has won, but doctrine cannot breathe while aircraft are both landing and being rearmed. Carriers must either launch a hurried, underprotected strike now or recover returning planes before launching a fully escorted attack later. Nagumo chooses the latter. The disciplined, doctrinally correct choice that at sea reads like prudence: recover his returning planes, consolidate his strikes, and avoid piecemeal sorties. The choice will cost time and, in the thin arithmetic of aerial war, life. Worse, the fighter umbrella that once hovered high now droops toward the horizon. American torpedo squadrons, obsolete TBD devastators flying low and slow, press on with suicidal bravery. Their torpedo attacks, though ineffective at scoring hits, tear Japanese combat air patrols down to sea level. They become a living bait, the zeros and cap drawn down, the skies cleared above the carriers. On Akagi and Kaga and Soryu decks, men watch their cap work the sea and hope the worst is past. On the bridge at 10:20 there is a sense of relief. The launches are being prepared. The crews breathe easier. Engines cough. Pilots shoulder into their cockpits. They are exquisitely exposed. Then the air above shifts. From nearly 20,000 feet, almost out of the sun itself, American SBD Dauntless dive bombers, precise, heavy bomb-laden and unseen because Japanese lookouts and fighters are focused elsewhere, appear in a sudden blue alleyway. They fall like iron from the sky. On Akagi's deck, a lookout's shout is the first real warning. There is no time for doctrine. Bombs find hangar decks packed with fueled, armed aircraft. Kaga's bridge is struck. Soryu is bathed in fire. Akagi takes hits that punch through upper hangars into the maelstrom of munitions and fuel. In minutes, carriers become furnaces. From the viewpoint of Akagi's bridge, the scene is visceral and unreal. Flame pillars bite into the sky, heat shimmering its edges. Men stagger, shouting orders and prayers at once. Captains' voices turn to urgent staccato. Damage control teams are hurled into impossibility, and Nagumo, who has spent his career in method and preparation, stands stunned as well-oiled machinery of victory is transformed into wreckage. What began as precise confidence within doctrine ends in chaos. The carrier's design, hangars full of armed aircraft, tight fuel stowage, and a tempo built around quick strikes, now magnifies damage into catastrophe. At 10:20 on the Akagi, the Kido Butai's mastery of the Pacific meets a conjunction of intelligence, timing, and audacity it did not expect. The disciplined choices that had won battles, secrecy, coordination, doctrinal fidelity, collide with a stranger calculus, surprise that has been stolen by codebreakers, diversionary tactics that have pulled cap low, and an enemy willing to accept losses to achieve a single, decisive effect. In a single burning instant, the carrier's lucky chain is broken. Fire and decision. The collapse of order aboard Kaga, Soryu, and Akagi. The first minute after the bombs hit feels like a separate world. On Akagi, the deck is a furnace. Heat rolls across steel like an ocean swell. Men who had moved with machine precision a heartbeat earlier now stumble and shout, their voices lost to the roar. Fuel vapor ignites in a series of white flashes that run like a fuse through the crowded hangars. 1,000 living details conspire against survival. Shrapnel that chews through communication lines, detonations that flip reality, men dazed by concussion who stagger into blazing corridors. Damage control parties, trained for emergencies but never for this scale, race down ladders with blankets and hoses only to be driven back by secondary explosions as bombs find munitions stowed below. On Kaga, the catastrophe is immediate and personal. 1,000 pounds of TNT smash through her decking and slam into planes being readied. The bridge is shattered. The captain and senior staff are mortally wounded. Smoke pours from the funnels like a funeral bier. Boatswain's mates try to cut loose burning aircraft with axes. Others attempt to jettison ordnance over the side as if brute force can unmake a tide. But the ship's internal design funnels heat and flame inward. The very efficiency that allowed rapid arming now concentrates calamity. Sailors are boiled from the decks. Men leap into the sea to escape the inferno, only to face burning oil on the surface. The sight is apocalyptic. Soryu, hit shortly after, wears the same fate in a different register. 3 bombs strike in quick succession, each one breaching decks where torpedoes and fuel lie. The carrier lists as fire eats through sheathed metal. Smoke thins the sky, and the small geometry of the world dissolves. Instrumentation, signal flags, and the ordered clack of feet give way to screaming, prayer, and the slapping of water as men abandon ship. Hiryu, positioned farther north and at that moment spared, watches the calamity unfold across the horizon with a horrible clarity. The fires on the sister ships become a mirror of what might soon be their own decks. Throughout the Kido Butai, a chain of failures compounds the physical destruction. Command and control is fragile in any carrier action. It is a web of visual signals, radio, and practiced routines. Explosions sever that web. Nagumo's staff, some injured, some missing. Attempts to regain structure, organize a counter-launch, coordinate rescue and suppression, re-establish fighter patrols. But critical pieces of the plan are gone. The airborne scout reports that should have kept Nagumo apprised of American carrier positions are patchy. The surprise of the dive bombers has cost him the initiative. Confusion breeds conservative choice. Release the ship's remaining air groups to attempt retaliation, or save what is left to protect the fleet. Nagumo vacillates. The weight of doctrine. Never launch unescorted strikes. Maintain the cap. Pulls him toward caution. Yet caution now reads like paralysis. On the flight decks, human stories narrow the shock into particulars you can almost touch. A young pilot barely returned from the Midway strike, watches his comrades burn and realizes his aircraft is now useless. A veteran petty officer, hands raw from work, drags a hose across a deck and tries to douse a bombed fuselage only to be shoved back by an explosion that lifts him off his feet. A signalman, face streaked with black, tries to wave a desperate semaphore to an incoming plane that will never land. His arms tremble as he thinks of their families and of how small a life maps against the ship's steel. The American attackers do not linger to watch carnage. The dauntlesses that struck come off the dive low, rejoin their formation, and vanish into the sun toward the east. They have done their work with a professionalism that treats destruction as the grim currency of victory. Their timing. The consequence of code-breaking, opportunism, and a string of sacrificial torpedo attacks that drew Cap down. Seems ordained. The Japanese are left to measure the result. At 11 a.m., as fires still rage, a grim calculus takes shape. Damage control reports predict Kaga and Soryu are beyond saving. Akagi burns with lethal intensity. Emergency scuttling charges are set to prevent the carriers falling into enemy hands. Rescue craft begin to pick up survivors who can be found amid the oil slick. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi on Hiryu, witnessing the destruction of 3 carriers and the death of so many comrades, pushes his crew past exhaustion. He orders immediate strikes, though the damage to his sister ships and the uncertainty about American forces complicate any plan. For a brief window, he embodies the cultural resolve that moves from ritual to action, strike back or die trying. The Hiryu does launch. Waves of aircraft, torpedo bombers and dive squadrons, climb and race toward the American carriers, finding Yorktown, already damaged in earlier actions, but still afloat and operational. Hiryu's pilots score hits, and for a time, it seems the Japanese can at least wound the enemy. But their success is a single reed against a forest. American damage control on Yorktown is practiced and ferocious. Repairs are patched with a speed born of necessity. Meanwhile, the Enterprise and Hornets air groups, aided by fighters that evade the remaining cap, probe for further strikes. As afternoon turns toward dusk, the U.S. Navy brings its own combination of persistence and industrial advantage to bear. For Nagumo and his staff, the moral and strategic aftermath is a landscape of loss that words skim but cannot capture. The Kido Butai, once the spear point of Japanese naval power, has been gutted. The carriers that launched the Pacific offensives are now burning hulks or dead in the water. The sailors and aviators who would have been the seed for future squadrons are gone or captured. The damage is not merely metallic or timbered. It is a human attrition that Japan's naval aviation system cannot quickly replace. The operational consequences are immediate. The combined fleet no longer possesses the concentrated carrier strength to force battle that Yamamoto had planned. The IJN has lost the initiative and, critically, lost the irreplaceable edge of experienced air crews and the tactical momentum that had defined 6 months of victories. As night draws a thin curtain over the ocean, survivors huddle in small boats on life rafts and on the decks of escorting cruisers. Those left afloat stare at the glowing columns where their ships had burned and sunk. Testimony that the age of Japanese carrier ascendancy is over. Across the water, the U.S. carriers count their losses, too. Damaged ships and lives lost, but a strategic victory that will echo through the remainder of the Pacific War. Midnight decisions, codebreakers, and the strategic turning point night does not soften the arithmetic. In the wake of the midday inferno, the combined fleet's command structure is adrift. Ships burning, air crews gone, radio silence stretched thin with the static of damaged transmitters. Vice Admiral Nagumo, once the implacable center of carrier doctrine, finds himself a man of ruined options. He must decide whether to withdraw, to attempt to salvage what remains, or to press an operation that no longer resembles the original plan. His choices are political as well as military. Admiral Yamamoto, at the heart of the enterprise, has staked prestige and strategy on this operation. A retreat would be acknowledged not simply as a tactical setback, but as the rupture of a strategic gamble. But before those debates harden into orders, it is worth stepping away from the decks and into the quiet rooms where the battle's invisible edge was forged. While Japanese admirals rehearsed their trap in the Pacific, a small team in Station Hypo, the U.S. Navy's cryptanalytic unit at Pearl Harbor, had quietly upended the battlefield. Led by Joseph Rochefort, codebreakers had been chipping away at JN-25 for weeks. Their work was meticulous. Statistical deductions, painstaking cross-checks, and a high-risk gambit to confirm that AF in intercepted traffic was indeed Midway. When Midway's base radioed a fake shortage of fresh water and the Japanese code answered, the Americans were able to say with unusual certainty, the target is Midway, and the date is early June. That knowledge permitted Admiral Chester Nimitz to concentrate an inferior force at the crucial hour. Nimitz's gamble, risking 3 carriers against the presumed might of the Japanese, looks today like nerve. At the time, it was a rare instance where intelligence permitted audacity. The Americans had little in raw firepower, but had something more valuable, knowledge of where to strike and when. That, combined with doctrinal willingness to accept losses in service of a decisive blow, turned the tide. Back aboard the surviving Japanese ships, the human calculus of loss continues. The dead are counted, but the measure that breaks the IJN is not numbers alone. It is experience. Naval aviation is built on a tacit and slow currency. Hours in the cockpit, hard lessons learned in the fire of a carrier's deck, the quiet mentoring of veteran pilots to younger men. Midway did not merely sink hulls, it severed the generational chain of experience. The pool of pilots and technicians who could operate complex carrier strike cycles had been drastically reduced. Japan lacked the training infrastructure and the industrial depth to recreate that pool quickly. Compounding these losses was a culture of secrecy and shame within the Imperial Navy. The government censored reports, keeping the scale of defeat from the public and even from many within the service. Survivors returned to home ports to a reception of silences and orders not to speak of the battle. This institutional denial hampered immediate learning. When organizations cannot confront error openly, the same mistakes repeat. The IJN's inability to fully reckon with what had failed, a rigid doctrine, risky ordnance handling practices, and underestimation of enemy intelligence, meant adaptations were slower and more piecemeal than they needed to be. Strategically, Midway's immediate fruits belonged to the United States. The U.S. Navy retained the carriers that mattered. The Japanese did not. Within months, American shipyards would produce more carriers, more planes, and more pilots. The industrial gradient tipped decisively in favor of the United States, a fact Yamamoto had foreseen and worried about. What Midway did in a single stroke was to remove Japan's capacity to contest carrier battle on equal terms. The Pacific War would become one of attrition and logistics, not of daring carrier duels where veteran Japanese air crews could tilt outcomes. On June 5th and 6th, actions continued. The crippled USS Yorktown, hit once by Japanese strikes and later by submarine attack, would eventually be abandoned and sink, at cost to American hearts and material. Yet the strategic balance had shifted. The U.S. could afford such losses. The IJN could not. Hiryu's later airstrikes that fatally damaged Yorktown were a fierce, courageous rejoinder. But they were a last gasp from a force that no longer had the mass to follow through. The American carriers, though scarred, could rotate air groups and repair. They could keep fighting. Midway's echo resounded through Japanese command decisions. Yamamoto, who had orchestrated the complex trap, understood the loss in broader terms. He noted the erosion of Japan's offensive muscle. He lamented the acceleration of the American industrial machine that would soon turn the Pacific into a factory of steel and aviation. In private, he recognized that the window for decisive operations was narrower than ever. In public, censorship and propaganda would carry the fiction of victory for months. But naval officers knew the truth in the faces of the dead and in the burned stumps of their carriers. The battle's human toll is chilling. Some 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen perished over the course of the engagement and its immediate aftermath. Their loss included many of the IJN's best carrier aviators and technicians, men whose replacements would be raw, poorly trained, and rushed into service as the war ground on. The psychological effect, on morale, on command cohesion, on recruitment, was long-lasting. In the months following Midway, Japan's posture shifted from expansion to defense. The strategic initiative had moved. Midway also reshaped doctrine and procurement. The United States doubled down on carrier construction, improved radar and reconnaissance coordination, and refined damage control procedures. The Japanese, constrained by industrial limits and hampered by a culture that prized defense and secrecy, found it harder to pivot. Ironically, some practical lessons: stowage practices that exposed hangars to catastrophic chain reactions, the peril of rearming on deck in combat conditions, and the need for layered, high-altitude fighter cover, would be painfully learned only after costly losses. In the wider narrative of the Pacific War, Midway becomes the hinge. It is the day when the projection of Japanese carrier power failed and the momentum of the Allies accelerated. For the Japanese sailors who had once laughed at the notion of defeat, men who had been invincible in doctrine and practice, the shock was existential. They had been trained to accept risk and to accept doctrine. That doctrine, unadapted to changing conditions and compromised by surprise, had delivered them into catastrophe. As night fell and survivors floated amid wreckage, a new pattern took shape. The United States, with staggering industrial reserves and an intelligence breakthrough that turned knowledge into action, would rebuild and press forward. Japan, deprived of experienced air crews and feeling the sting of hubris, would be forced into a long defensive struggle. Midway was not just a naval battle. It was a historic pivot where intelligence, industrial capacity, and tactical audacity combined to overcome an empire's assumption of invincibility. Survivors, silence, and the weight of what remains, June 4th, late afternoon. The sea is a patchwork of slicks and smoke. On a battered destroyer's bridge, Commander Tairo Aoyoki, an air officer by trade, ash-smeared and clothes singed, leans on the rail and watches the horizon where his carriers once rode. He is alive, but alive like a man who has been pulled from a pyre. Hearing is raw, vision edges in and out with nausea, and every breath tastes of burning cordite and salt. The checklist that has always guided him, launch, recover, repair, is suddenly absurd in its normalcy. Around him, men whisper names and read manifests, matching faces to lists, trying to keep the arithmetic of loss from becoming a personal ledger of guilt. Aoyoki's hands remember what training cannot. As an air officer, he had spent years teaching pilots to press advantage, to time launches and manage fuel brackets. Now those skills look like a different language. He moves among survivors in a state half-automatic, cataloging which squadrons can still fly, which planes have serviceable radios, which engine shops retain a working lathe. Yet the hard truth is simple and immediate. The carriers are gone. The men who knew how to run them are fewer by thousands, and the systems that turned planes and crews into a coordinated spear, maintenance loops, pilot mentoring, and carrier decks with practice choreography, have been ruptured. Back in Tokyo, the Imperial Navy nudges its machinery into a mode of denial. Censors and officers craft communiques that speak of engagements and heroic sacrifices while avoiding any admission of strategic defeat. Survivors are told to keep silent. Oral histories are suppressed. Aoyoki, like many officers, is ordered to present a face of stoicism, to answer to a chain of command that insists the war continues on its planned trajectory. This official silence does not equal recovery. It creates a vacuum where real lessons should be learned. The technical and logistical consequences uncover themselves in small, brutal moments. Aoyoki supervises a work party trying to salvage avionics from a burnt Dauntless. A corroded magneto, scorched wiring, and a smashed gun sight remind him that aircraft are nodes in a wider system. Without experienced riggers, even undamaged airframes become dead weight. Pilots without proper maintenance support fly at increased risk. Mistakes multiply. The Imperial Navy's training pipeline, already compressed by months of continuous operations, cannot quickly substitute for the lost veterans who once taught the youngest lieutenants how a carrier breathes in combat. The human effect is more piercing. Aoyoki walks among men who have seen comrades vaporized in seconds. He meets a chief mechanic who had rigged Akagi's catapult belts for years. The man's hands shake when he speaks of the crew that didn't get to sail home. A young pilot confesses that his first carrier landing ended in routine. Now, asked to land on a patched deck in the dark, he trembles. Confidence is not a thing you replenish with steel. It is learned over years and through small, bone-deep repetitions that can't be manufactured overnight. Politically, the shock forces awkward conversations. Admiral Yamamoto privately recognizes the strategic cost. Japan has lost the concentrated carrier striking force that allowed it to seize the initiative across the Pacific. He knows what Aoyoki knows in his marrow. American industry will replace lost carriers and airframes at a pace Japan cannot match. Attrition will now be Japan's enemy. Yet public messages remain defiant. Admitting the scale of defeat would be admitting that the strategic gamble had failed. The result is a perverse alignment. Operational necessity pushes for candid adaptation, while political calculation demands silence. Japan attempts technical fixes. Shipyards are pressed, but capacity is limited by shortages of steel, fuel, and time. Training schools attempt to accelerate curricula. Simulation of carrier deck drills is intensified. Yet these measures contend with a harsher reality. You cannot rush experience. Nor can you instantly replace a culture of damage control honed by repeated crises. The very practices that made Japanese carriers efficient. Tight hangar fits, rapid rearming protocols, become liabilities under the new strategic calculus. Too few officers question this at the highest levels, and when they do, their voices are muffled by a culture that prizes offensive doctrine over candid introspection. On the American side, the celebration is tempered by pragmatism. Nimitz writes tabs not of arrogance but of urgency. The victory at Midway has to be leveraged into a campaign of sustained pressure. Enterprise and Hornet, blooded and patched, rotate air groups and replenish pilots. Yorktown, though later sunk, had been repaired at Pearl in a feat of engineering that shows the U.S. edge in industrial depth. Whereas Japan scrambles to reconstitute a lost core of expertise, the United States begins to scale operations, reproduce designs, and institutionalize the lessons crypto intelligence provided. The difference is not just resources, but an ability to convert tactical intelligence into operational advantage quickly and openly. For Aoyoki, the months after Midway become a curriculum in practical mourning. He is assigned to oversee training rotations, to take inexperienced pilots through repeated deck landings and emergency procedures. He fights to protect veteran instructors from being bled into frontline sorties and argues for improved stowage practices and revised rearming protocols. Some of his recommendations are adopted. Others are deferred or lost in bureaucratic logjams. Yet his efforts are tinged with a quiet desperation. Each new class he sends out carries fewer hours than his lost contemporaries once had, and every mission stretches the margin between prudence and catastrophe. In private, survivors like Aoyoki nurse resentments that are as much about culture as command. Victory disease, the complacency born of early success, left the IJN susceptible to surprise. Aoyoki, who had seen too much to believe in facile narratives, knows that Midway was not merely the result of American audacity. It was the consequence of institutional blindness to intelligence, of a doctrine that prized perfect execution over adaptive risk, and of a refusal to admit vulnerability when faced with inconvenient evidence. Yet voicing such critiques in peacetime is not permitted. In wartime, it is dangerous. As autumn approaches, the Pacific's vastness feels different. Where once Japanese carriers prowled with predictable dominance, now U.S. carrier groups move with increased confidence and growing numbers. The psychological shift is palpable among frontline crews. The aura of invincibility is gone. In naval barracks, talk drifts to lost names and to the image of flaming decks that will not leave the memory of those who survived. Aoyoki keeps a small, charred fragment of aluminum from Akagi in his kit, a tactile relic of a day when doctrine, timing, and surprise converged to overturn an empire's strategy. On the strategic map, Midway begins to be written as departure rather than conclusion. The Imperial Navy regroups and fights on with courage and initiative, but without the concentrated carrier edge that had once made decisive offensive operations possible. For Commander Tairo Aoyoki and the thousands who remained, the war would continue as a sequence of adaptations and losses, lessons sometimes learned too late and often paid for in blood. They had stood on the rim of triumph and watched it collapse into flame. Knowing the price of that collapse would shape every command decision and every quiet conversation for the years that followed. Aftermath and memory. What Midway cost Japan and what it taught the world. June 6, 1942. Dawn finds the ocean still and full of ghosts. The Kidobutai is a shadow of its former self. Survivors huddle in small groups, their faces mapped by soot and salt. Commander Tairo Aoyoki stands on the deck of a repair ship, watching cranes swing over burned wrecks and listening to the low, bureaucratic murmur that passes for official accounting. He is tasked with writing the immediate technical reports, lists of damage, inventories of lost aircraft types, serial numbers of engines gone to the deep. But the reports cannot catalog what counts most: the loss of institutional memory, the seam where experience was ripped apart, the carriers that went down. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and later Hiryu were more than hulls. They were repositories of tacit knowledge. Air groups aboard them carried years of refined tactics, the rhythms of coordinated launches, the small gestures and signals that made multi-squadron strikes precise, and the unspoken rules that kept fragile operations from sliding into chaos. Midway shredded that tacit knowledge. Training programs in Japan could produce pilots, but they could not quickly produce the seasoned crews who knew how to keep a carrier air group alive under fire. As Aoyoki writes in his private notes, which he buries beneath a locker so he can read them after the war, you cannot replace the hand that steadies a pilot's release or the voice that calls wind and deck at the instant of a carrier landing. The strategic consequences unfold with painful speed. Within months, American industrial output surges, and the U.S. Navy builds new fleet carriers and escort carriers at a rate Japan cannot match. The balance of ship numbers and, crucially, trained replacement aviators tilts inexorably. Japan still fights hard with tactical brilliance at times, but its ability to project decisive carrier power dwindles. The Pacific War shifts into a grinding contest of logistics, island by island, where industrial depth and supply lines matter more than a single admiral's audacity. Individual fates underscore the macro changes. Aoyoki meets men whose careers were ended in minutes. A chief petty officer who had trained 40 pilots now stares at a list with only 5 names intact. A squadron commander who had flown hundreds of missions is a skeleton of himself, refusing to speak except to mark time on diagrams of engine wear. Their knowledge: how to fix a worn gear reduction in a Catalina engine at sea under pressure, how to spay and patch a hydraulic line in a fighter during a midnight bustle, walks into the sea with them. The tempo of war leaves no time to mourn properly. Replacements are pressed into service with abbreviated instruction and a terrifying baptism. There is also the political and cultural aftermath. The Japanese government imposes silence, and public narratives are recast into heroic myth, engagements couched as victories or honorable losses. Senior officers are recalled to Tokyo. Some are censured quietly, others are shielded. Aoyoki receives reassignment orders but finds himself increasingly uncomfortable with institutional obfuscation. He writes memos recommending changes, revised arming procedures to avoid boarded hangars loaded with live ordnance, better distributed fuel storage, and protocols to keep fighters aloft during critical rearming phases. Some small reforms are implemented, but many are half measures. Stymied by resource shortages and a military culture slow to yield doctrine it considers proven. Across the ocean, in Washington and Pearl Harbor, the language is different. Midway is celebrated with quiet sobriety. The cost is acknowledged, and the victory is treated as a pivot that must be exploited. U.S. planners push for sustained carrier operations, broader pilot training programs, and investment in radar and long-range reconnaissance. The lessons taken are systemic. Intelligence can be decisive. Industrial capacity is a weapon. Damage control saves ships. The Americans institutionalize these lessons with the force of resources and open critique, where failures are analyzed and turned into new doctrine. The memory of Midway grows complicated with time. In Japan, survivors grapple with shame and silence. Veterans like Aoyoki carry the battle inside them. Their testimonies, when finally voiced decades later, are raw and unsettled. He speaks in quiet interviews after the war, describing the smell of burning canvas and the small, heroic acts of crewmen who tried to cut burning planes loose with lances and axes. He describes how a single, well-timed dive bomber attack changed the arc of history. He tells young officers that the worst enemy is not bullets but complacency, that the most dangerous moment is when success has taught you cannot be surprised. Internationally, historians mark Midway as a turning point that reshaped naval strategy. It validated carrier-centric doctrine for an era, proved the lethal synergy of intelligence and operational daring, and underlined the limits of tactics divorced from an industrial base. Architects of naval aviation studied the action for decades, how reconnaissance lapses, ordnance handling practices, and doctrinal rigidity created openings that a determined and informed enemy could exploit. Naval academies around the world use Midway as a case study in the interplay of intelligence, command decision, and organizational learning. For Aoyoki personally, the war's end brings neither vindication nor closure, only a slow gnawing account of what was lost. He retires into a Japan remade by defeat and occupation. There are new air forces to help build, different doctrines to teach, and a younger generation whose experience of aviation begins in peace rather than in the crucible of carrier warfare. In lectures and memoirs, he stresses one point above all: the necessity of institutional honesty. A battle is not won by the bravest man alone, he writes. It is won by the organization that faces its errors and changes. Midway then remains a teaching story for commanders and a moral for citizens. Empires falter when overconfidence blinds them to intelligence, when doctrine ossifies into dogma, and when the human fabric that trains, sustains, and repairs the fighting edge is taken for granted. The carriers went down in 5 minutes for reasons that were technical and tactical, yes, but also cultural and institutional. In the ash and the rusted metal that came home from the Pacific, there is a lesson written in the hands of men like Tairo Aoyoki, skills that cannot be replaced quickly, and that decide wars as surely as any salvo.